Netflix knew you were stealing. They didn't just suspect it. They had the data, the patterns, the IP addresses, the account overlaps. They could see entire households, sometimes entire neighborhoods, watching on a single subscription. And for over a decade, they did almost nothing to stop it. No aggressive bans, no strict enforcement, no hard paywalls, just a quiet tolerance that, on the surface, made absolutely no sense. Because if people are using your product without paying, the obvious move is to shut it down immediately. That's what most companies would do. Protect their revenue. Close the loophole. Stop the leak. But Netflix didn't. Instead, they let it happen. And not by accident. They let it happen on purpose. Because what looks like a loss was actually a part of a much bigger strategy. At first glance, password sharing feels like pure theft. One person pays, five people watch. Revenue lost, right? But that assumption only holds if you treat every non-paying user as a missed sale. And that's where most people get it wrong. Because in reality, most of those people were never going to pay in the first place. Not yet, at least. They didn't know the value. They weren't convinced. They weren't hooked. So if Netflix had blocked them early, they wouldn't have converted into paying users. They would have just disappeared. Which means the real question isn't how much Netflix is losing. The real question is how much future customers they were quietly creating. Think about the first time someone gave you their Netflix password. You didn't sign up, you didn't commit, you just tried it. Maybe you watched one show, then another, then suddenly you had favorites. You had habits. You had the reason to come back. And over time, something subtle happens. Netflix stopped feeling like someone else's account. It started feeling like your own platform. Your shows, your recommendations, your routine, and that's when the shift happens. Because once a product becomes a part of your life, paying for it no longer feels like a cost. It feels like maintaining something you already own. That's the core idea behind what economists sometimes call sampling, or what business often refer to as freemium. But Netflix took it further. They turned piracy into a distribution channel. Instead of fighting unauthorized users, they allowed them to experience the product fully. No ads, no restrictions, no watered down versions. The exact same experience as a paying customer. And that's important, because it means the perceived value wasn't limited. It was amplified. Every borrowed account became a fully immersive trial. Now here's where the strategy gets interesting. Because Netflix isn't just thinking about individual users, they are thinking in terms of network effects. The more people who use Netflix, the more viable it becomes. Not just because of revenue, but because of culture. Shows became shared experiences. Conversations started forming around them. Memes, discussions, recommendations. When more people watch the same content, it spreads faster. And when it spreads faster, it becomes more desirable. So even people who weren't paying were still contributing to the ecosystem. They were increasing the platform's relevance. This creates a feedback loop. More users lead to more cultural impact. More cultural impact leads to more demand. More demand leads to more paying subscribers. So even if some users weren't paying directly, they were still indirectly driving growth. And that's a very different way of thinking about value. Instead of asking, is this user paying right now? Netflix was asking, is this user making the platform stronger? This kind of thinking shows up in other places too. In the early days of software, companies like Microsoft faced massive piracy issues, especially in markets like China. People were using Windows without paying for it. At a scale, it would normally trigger aggressive enforcement. But instead of shutting it down completely, Microsoft took a more patient approach. Because even pirated users were learning the system, building familiarity, and creating a standard. So when businesses and institutions needed legitimate versions, they chose the software they already knew. Piracy, in a strange way, became a form of market penetration. Something similar happened with Adobe. Creative professionals around the world were using pirated versions of Photoshop and other tools. On paper, that's lost revenue. But in practice, it generated a generation of users trained on Adobe products. So when those users entered the professional world, They didn't switch tools. They paid for the ones that they're already dependent on. Again, what looked like a loss in the short term became dominance in the long term. Netflix applied the same logic, but in the context of entertainment. They weren't just selling access to content, they were building habits, and habits take time. You don't form them overnight. You form them through repeated exposure, through convenience, through emotional connection. So instead of cutting off non-paying users early, Netflix allowed those habits to form naturally. And once they were strong enough, conversion became much easier. This is where game theory comes in. Because Netflix wasn't just reacting to user behavior, they were anticipating it. They understood that users move through stages. First, exposure, then engagement, then dependency, and finally, willingness to pay. If you try to force payment too early, you lose the user. But if you wait too long, you risk losing money on the table. So the challenge is timing. When do you switch from growth mode to monetization mode? When do you stop tolerating and start enforcing? This is what's known as an optimal stopping problem. You're trying to choose the best moment to change your strategy, based on incomplete information and evolving conditions. If you act too soon, you cut off potential growth. If you act too late, you miss out on revenue. So the goal isn't to maximize fairness, it's to maximize total value over time. For Netflix, this meant waiting. Not because they couldn't enforce password restrictions, but because enforcing them too early would have slowed down adoption. In the early years, they needed scale. They needed people talking about their shows, sharing accounts, spreading the platform. Every detail viewer made Netflix more relevant, and relevance is what drives long-term success and entertainment. But over time, something changed. Netflix reached a point where it was no longer trying to prove its value. It had already done that. It had hit massive subscriber numbers. It had global recognition. It had original content that people couldn't get elsewhere anymore. At that stage, the marginal benefit of additional non-paying users started to decrease. They were no longer fueling growth as much as they were limiting revenue. And that's when the strategy flipped. Suddenly, password sharing wasn't just tolerated. It was targeted. New policies were introduced. Account restrictions tightened. Extra fees appeared for additional households. And for many users, it felt abrupt, even unfair. Why now? Why after all these years? Why let people get used to something and then take it away? But from a game theory perspective, the timing wasn't random. It was calculated. Netflix waited until the value of converting existing users outweighed the value acquiring new users through sharing. In other words, they were waiting until the ecosystem was strong enough to sustain enforcement. Think about it like farming. In the beginning, you don't harvest immediately. You plant seeds, you water them, you let them grow. If you try to harvest too early, you get almost nothing. But if you wait until the right moment, you maximize your yield. Netflix wasn't hunting for immediate revenue. They were farming long-term growth. And once the crop was ready, they harvested. The crackdown wasn't about stopping theft. It was about converting dependency into revenue. By the time restrictions were introduced, millions of users were already deeply integrated into the platform. They had watch lists, recommendations, favorite shows, ongoing series. Walking away wasn't easy anymore. So when faced with the choice, pay or lose access, many chose to pay. Not because they suddenly agreed with the policy, but because the cost of leaving felt higher than the cost of subscribing. This is what makes the strategy so effective. It doesn't rely on forcing users to pay upfront. It relies on making the product valuable enough that users choose to pay later. And that shift from enforcement to voluntarily conversion is where the real power lies. But there's also a trade-off. Because strategies like this can feel manipulative, letting users get comfortable in a certain behavior and then restricting it later can create backlash. People don't like feeling like the rules change mid-game. And from a purely ethical perspective, there's an argument to be made that companies should be consistent from the start. But businesses aren't optimizing for fairness, they're optimizing for outcomes. And in competitive markets, the companies that survive are often the ones that understand human behavior the best, even when that behavior doesn't align with idealized notions of logic or, in this case, fairness. The deeper lesson here isn't just about Netflix. It's about how value is created over time. Not all losses are losses. Some are investments. And not all enforcement is about control. Sometimes it's about timing. In many systems, the best strategy isn't to eliminate exploitation immediately. It's to allow it temporarily, if it leads to a larger benefit later. That doesn't mean exploitation is good. It means that under certain conditions, tolerating it can be strategically optimal. This idea shows up in unexpected places. Platforms that allow free users before monetizing, games that let players progress without paying, then introduce purchases later, even social systems where initial generosity builds trust before stricter rules are applied. The pattern is the same: growth first, enforcement later. And once you start seeing it, you realize how counterintuitive it is. Because instincts tell us to protect what's ours immediately, to close gaps, to stop losses. But in complex systems, immediate protection can limit long-term potential. Sometimes, letting people take a little creates more value than stopping them entirely. So when you look back at Netflix's decision to allow password sharing for so long, it stops looking like a mistake. It starts looking like patience, a deliberate choice to delay short-term gains in order to build something bigger. And the next time you see a company tolerating behavior that seems exploitative, it's worth asking a different question. Not, why are they stopping this? But, what are they gaining by allowing it? Because sometimes, the smartest moves isn't to fight the system. It's to let it run until the moment it's right to change the rules.